Thank you, Paul Bonici, who is right there, who has just given me the signal that we are live in front of our audience. I want to welcome all of you to this special event. We're delighted. We have finished up with Humanities in Action this semester, and we had really great talks last week. Lanice Williams gave a wonderful talk on art history and reproduction of African-American images. Really fascinating stuff. We're going to move completely in another direction now and go way back in time, and just a little bit of history on this particular talk. Our dear colleague and friend, Dr. Brett Whalen, who we've worked with several times in many programs, he came on the radio with us. I think it was late March. It was very soon after all of this had started happening, because we just wanted a perspective on the Black Death as probably the most well-known pandemic in world history, and just some perspective, some lessons we can learn from it. So I'm going to speak a little bit more about how that developed, but we couldn't resist, and we're so delighted to have Dr. Whalen here to discuss this project, which again I will mention in a moment. But before I get too far along in that, I want to thank all of our friends. First of all, our sponsors, the Cotton Merker Group at Morgan Stanley, who have been wonderful contributors to our programs. We have wonderful support from Carolina Meadows, a retirement community in Chapel Hill, who are also supporting us through our online efforts as well. The GAA, a fantastic partner in many programs, including last night's great forum on the elections that consider this Elections 2020 panel that we had last night, a really wonderful discussion. And the GAA is a partner in many of our projects and programs this semester, so we're so thankful for their support. And finally, of course, Flyleaf Books. We are here in Flyleaf Books, which is now open. The floor is open for limited customers to come in. Of course, they have wonderful curbside pickup as well. But we've been here all fall working in the back room of Flyleaf Books, where normally we have you participants live in seats, and we're just so delighted to be partnering with them. It feels like we're home here, and we're happy to be in your homes and bringing Flyleaf Books to you. So, of course, go to flyleafbooks.com if you're interested in any of what they have to offer, including curbside and ordering and etc. So, Flyleaf Books, thank you. I also want to encourage anyone to consider giving to Carolina Public Humanities. Carolina Public Humanities is still doing all of this work to bring great faculty and scholarship to the public. Of course, it's mitigated by this technology, but we're working hard to provide great programming, giving this access to the public. And in particular, we're continuing to work with our community college communities and our K through 12 teachers. Those we need as much help as we can get, so we thank you for considering giving to Carolina Public Humanities so we can continue those outreach efforts. We hope soon enough we'll all be back live. But we will always need your support, so thank you for considering giving to that. I also want to, just before we get involved, I want to bring up a few upcoming programs that should be of interest. I mentioned the GAA have been partnering with us in many programs. We have our Lunch with Friends and Strangers program. This is a biographical conversations. They occur, the next one is coming up this Friday, and our colleague from the History Department, Don Raleigh, will be joining me to talk about Leonid Brezhnev. My favorite Soviet leader, or at least the one that I was raised around, and I just always associate with Soviet leaders. So that should be fun. We also have other great programs with Lunch with Friends and Strangers. So please go to our humanities.unc.edu and check out those offerings. We have a wonderful weekend seminar coming up. This one actually is on a weekend. We're going to be on Saturday, October 23rd, this Saturday, offering Cities of Music, Vienna and Nashville, two localities that I know you put together in your mind all the time, but what they do share is a love of music. So we have Dr. Jocelyn Neal and from the music department, and then what brilliant pianist Robert Buxton. Robert Buxton will be playing pieces that are associated with Vienna as well as discussing them, and of course Jocelyn Neal is just an expert at breaking down country music and telling us why Nashville is so important. So join us on Saturday. If you're interested, go to humanities.unc.edu to sign up for that. We have one more seminar after that coming up, and that will be, of course, our seminar with Dr. Bart Ehrman, which will be occurring after the election. It'll be on Heaven and Hell, an encore presentation. Perhaps your perspective on the election will inform what you're interested in learning about after the election. But that should be great. So again, humanities.unc.edu. We also want to remind you folks that the Big Read is kicking off. I'm not sure what we have left for reading groups, but that is a wonderful program that we're working with the Ackland Museum. It's an NEA grant called The Big Read, and we're going to be looking in particular at LGBTQ LGBTQ plus voices in a variety of reading events. So please go to humanities.unc.edu for information on that, and of course ackland.org. Okay. That is enough because I want to get on to the program here. I mentioned that Dr. Brett Whalen, our good friend, we asked him to talk about the plague, and he continued to think about the plague. And my colleague Paul is going to drop into the chat here his latest actual production, where an essay of sorts written and produced over the summer, lessons from the medieval plague, and should be an absolutely fascinating talk. This talk, I assume, is going to speak to many of the issues in that text as well. So without further ado, let's get right to it. The quicker we bring the talk on the plague, the quicker this pandemic will end. That's my theory, and I'm sticking with it. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Brett Whalen.
I was mentioning to Max, I don't normally dress up quite this much for giving talks like this, but it was so exciting to come out of my house and not be wearing the same like baggy jeans and t-shirt I've been wearing for 6 months. I figured I would take full advantage of the opportunity. I would like to thank Max, also Paul, Flyleaf Books, and Lloyd Kramer, the director of Carolina Public Humanities, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. I very much appreciate it. And I do think, we're also potentially isolated right now, and apart, that the mission of Carolina Public Humanities to bring people together around these conversations is that much more important. So thank you, Carolina Public Humanities. So I've been teaching medieval history at Carolina since 2005. And more or less every year, I offer a large lecture class on the Middle Ages. It runs from the late ancient world up to the modern period, covering about 1,000 years, 500 to 1,500. Roughly. Each time I teach that class, I tell my students that something will happen during the course of the semester that will bring our historical subject matter into dialogue with current events. Every semester, uncannily, something does. For example, the unearthing of the Staffordshire Hoard, an immensely rich Anglo-Saxon burial site, which we were discussing in 2009, as we looked at post-Roman Britain, or the retirement of Benedict XVI and the election of Pope Francis in 2013, when we were discussing the history of the medieval papacy and papal elections, or violent terrorist attacks by the so-called Islamic State that evoked the medieval caliphate in 2014, even as we were exploring the Crusades. I was teaching that very class in the spring of 2020 and made the same promise. Little did I know that the surprise in store for us that particular semester was a global pandemic. The outbreak of COVID-19, which by March of that year, among many other devastating consequences, had effectively shuttered large segments of the American economy and closed college campuses everywhere. After spring break, when we resumed teaching remotely, the subject on my syllabus was, coincidentally, I suppose, the Black Death, the medieval pandemic of bubonic plague that struck Europe, among other regions of the world, in the mid-14th century, killing anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of the population. The Black Death makes it onto the short list of medieval subjects that virtually everyone has heard of, thanks in part to high school history classes that cannot resist mentioning such an attention-grabbing subject, and even more so, I think, due to references in popular culture, books, movies, video games. The very word Black Death, the very words Black Death, conjure images of diseased bodies, corpses littering the streets, and helpless medieval people despairing of any cure, who took refuge in either wanton excess, partying in the face of doom, or excessive piety, flagellating themselves bloody as they prayed to God to save them. That is, if they weren't too busy killing Jews, whom they blamed for causing the plague by poisoning water sources. Viewed from the perspective of the popular imagination, the European response to the Black Death seems to provide an open and shut case for the fundamental irrationality, backwardsness, and crudeness of the Middle Ages, compared with the modern era that ostensibly enjoys superior scientific knowledge about disease, medical technologies, and institutions for public health. Generally speaking, combating these sorts of stereotypes about the medieval era has been a staple of my career as a scholar and a teacher. First, by pointing out that medieval individuals and societies were far more sophisticated than we give them credit for. And second, by poking holes in the assumption that the conditions and modalities of modernity must inevitably be an improvement over those of the medieval past. Now, before the spring of 2020, frankly, I hadn't spent too much time thinking about how the Black Death might fit into this equation, challenging stereotypes about the Middle Ages, the modern age, and their relationship to each other. The coronavirus changed all that. In the early weeks of social distancing and stay-at-home orders, I found myself rereading the opening to the Decameron, the famous collection of 100 tales written by the 14th-century Italian author and plague survivor Giovanni Boccaccio, who provides a chilling description of the Black Death's impact on Florence. I felt like I was reading the headlines as I encountered Boccaccio with fresh eyes and a newfound sense of historical empathy. For example, when I read his description of how some people withdrew into isolation as a reaction to the plague, while others continued defiantly to socialize, treating the outbreak as an enormous joke, as he puts it, while still others tried to strike some balance between these two extremes. Or again, as I read his relation of how the pandemic made it impossible to care for the sick or hold funerals in the accustomed manner. Or again, his account of how civil authorities tried to curtail the spread of the disease in the city through public health measures meant to limit commerce and improve hygiene, which, he laments, had little success. Inspired to dig deeper, urged on by friends and family who seemed equally and newly curious about the medieval plague, and also by the radio program, the Aaron Keck Show, which that I spoke with, as Max mentioned before, I began to digest other sources for the Black Death: chronicles, letters, sermons, medical tracts, and more. I also began to review the most up-to-date scholarly literature on the subject across multiple disciplines, or at least the ones I could consult online. Needless to say, I didn't have access to a physical library when I began researching this topic. An overall theme began to emerge from these historical investigations, one which I pursue in my book, Remembering the Black Death, Lessons from the Medieval Plague for the Modern Pandemic, and I'll briefly discuss with you here today, namely, the possibility that the Black Death might have something to teach us about how to navigate a global pandemic, might offer us inspiration or consolation or cautionary tales as we remember the 14th century plague. Entering into this dialogue with the past, we discover that the medieval experience of the Black Death was remarkably familiar, for better or worse, reminding us, on the one hand, not to make assumptions about the simplicity or essential inferiority of people in the past, and on the other, not to be too smug about our own supposed superiority in the present. Indeed, I would submit to you at the outset of this talk that, given the undeniable advancements we enjoy in epidemiology, medicine, and public health, our shortcomings and lapses of judgment in the face of the coronavirus seem all the more remarkable, and perhaps in some cases unforgivable, than those of 7 centuries ago. So, an initial lesson from my recent studies of the medieval plague: when confronting a pandemic, get the facts and don't believe everything you hear. By their nature, pandemics seem to spread confusion, rumors, and misinformation. This goes for historical pandemics and contemporary ones. When I first began to research the Black Death, I realized that I knew a lot less about the subject than I had previously assumed. I knew, or thought I knew, the basics, which I will review here with you now. The Black Death was a form of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And it's called bubonic, named after the buboes or lumps, which appear as a sign of the disease in the groin or typically in the armpits or the neck. It's an enzootic disease that is naturally existing among rodent populations. The plague spreads to people primarily via flea bites when newly infected rodents die and their fleas seek a new host. It can also be transmitted person to person in its pneumonic form, infecting the lungs and spreading via droplets coughed up into the air, much like the coronavirus. The outbreak we call the Black Death began in Central Asia in the 1330s before reaching the edges of Europe in the region of the Black Sea via the Silk Roads, the ancient trade routes that link Africa, Europe, and Asia. Starting in 1347, Italian merchants, specifically Genoese, brought the plague by ship to European shores. From there, over the following 3 years, the Black Death reached into virtually every corner of the continent, killing millions and disrupting 14th century society to an existential extent. What I didn't appreciate at the time when I started doing my research was that nearly every element of this narrative has been contested, debated, or challenged in recent decades by scholars, not just by historians, but archaeologists and epidemiologists. Getting the facts on the Black Death requires hard work. Up until 20 years ago, some historians insisted that the medieval pandemic was not actually the bubonic plague, but a form of anthrax or some other disease. DNA testing of teeth pulp from contemporary graves, which preserves traces of the infection, has demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that the 14th century outbreak was in fact bubonic plague, more or less the same bacterium, caused by the same bacterium that unleashed a pandemic in Southeast Asia in the late 19th century. Others have argued that the outbreak of bubonic plague, which caused the Black Death, began to spread in rodent populations around Asia far earlier than the mid-14th century, perhaps transmitted by the Mongols during their conquests in the 13th century. Still others doubt that the disease could have been spread along the Silk Roads, as is commonly assumed. Given the logistics and slow pace of medieval travel, it would have been difficult for sufficient numbers of rats and fleas to circulate, reaching sufficient levels of bacterial load to cause a full-blown pandemic. Under these conditions, by the way, person-to-person transmission seems even more unlikely. Simply put, people with the deadly and fast-acting pneumonic form of the plague would die before they could get very far and spread the disease. And this goes for people on ships as well. I realized that I had to rethink one of my favorite stories about the origins of the Black Death, which I've told to students over the years. First given by the Italian lawyer Gabriele de Mussis, who survived the plague in his native Piacenza. Gabriele reports that Genoese merchants in the port of Caffa on the Black Sea were first infected in 1346, when a plague-ridden Mongol army besieging the city began to catapult infected corpses over the walls. An act sometimes described in popular histories as one of the first known instances of biological warfare. But it turns out this probably never happened. This dubious episode was added to Gabriel's chronicle at a much later date, probably by another author. Its authenticity is suspect. Even if it did happen, the launching of plague victims into Caffa wouldn't have been responsible for spreading the Black Death. Infected bodies don't transmit the plague. Fleas do. But typically, fleas abandon a cooling corpse within minutes. Even if a few stray fleas were catapulted into the city on the bodies of the deceased, this wouldn't have been enough to spread the disease. The just numbers wouldn't be there. Right? Based on what we now know about Yersinia pestis, the Black Death must have spread into Caffa and other ports on the Black Sea via fleas carried on rats, which must have traveled through cracks in the walls and sewers, slowly infecting rodents on the inside before the disease jumped to humans. And this is a less exciting story, but it's one that makes a lot more sense epidemiologically and given what we know of the disease. Given all of this uncertainty over the course of the Black Death, despite a century or more of careful research, is it any surprise that wild rumors, confusion, and outright lies have surrounded the coronavirus, the outbreak of the coronavirus? As I'm sure many of you are aware, thanks in part to the wonders of modern communication, i.e. the internet, all sorts of bizarre tales, disinformation, and conspiracy theories have circulated about COVID-19. Despite all signs that point to the disease's natural origins in the region of Wuhan, China, peddlers of actual fake news declared that the virus was engineered in a Chinese bioweapons lab. Others linked its origins to the creation of 5G telecommunications networks. It's part of like an elaborate cover-up of some sort. Still others tied its beginning to the consumption of bat soup in a thinly veiled racist jab at Chinese culinary habits. In the early days of the outbreak, satellite photos made the rounds on social media, showing clouds of sulfur dioxide hovering over Wuhan, evidence of mass crematoria burning the bodies of coronavirus victims to conceal the extent of the pandemic. Much like the catapulted bodies at Tana in 1346, however, this startling story was too good to be true. As fullfact.org stated for the record, and I quote, "These claims are wrong. The maps the claims are based on are not satellite images, and they do not reveal observed data on current levels of sulfur dioxide." It turns out they weren't even actually pictures of Wuhan, China. In March, the World Health Organization labeled this mixture of misleading information and deliberate falsehoods its own kind of infodemic. Pandemics and infodemics, it seems, are fellow travelers. Like an historian carefully investigating and evaluating the evidence for past events, those of us living through a pandemic in the present have to get the facts and not believe everything we hear during a global pandemic. Speaking of facts, this leads to our second lesson, and it's related to the first one. Listen to the experts. In October 1348, as the plague first began to strike the Kingdom of France, its king, Philip VI, decided that he should seek information about the pestilence from the medical faculty at the University of Paris. In the interest of the public good, as they called it, the professors compiled a, quote, compendium about the distant and immediate causes of the present and universal epidemic. While the university masters didn't deny God's ultimate role in unleashing the pestilence as a punishment for human sins, we'll talk about this more in a moment, they emphasized instead the natural causes of the great mortality, as they called it, afflicting their world. They identified two principal causes for the pestilence. First, the corruption of the air due to a conjunction of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter in the constellation of Aquarius. Second, a worsening of that miasma when earthquakes released noxious vapors into the atmosphere. When breathed into the body, that miasma could disrupt the balance of its humors, overheat the heart and lungs, and rot the surrounding moisture. It thereby putrefied and destroyed the life force. Now, needless to say, those university professors were wrong about the origins of the Black Death. It's caused by a deadly bacterium, not a miasma produced by the conjunction of planets or earthquakes. Yet, we shouldn't fault 14th century physicians for not knowing about bacteria. By the standards of the day, the Paris masters' explanations for the outbreak of the Black Death were internally consistent and logical. They represented the best available science. In medieval astronomical and astrological thought, planets possess certain qualities that govern their influence on Earth. The sort of conjunction described by the professors was a perfect storm for causing a pandemic, in their understanding. Their opinions about disease and its impact on the body represented the most sophisticated knowledge taught at the university, based on ancient authorities such as Aristotle, Galen, and Hippocrates. Doctors at the time couldn't cure the bubonic plague. I mean, no one could until the 20th century with the invention of antibiotics. Many of the preventative measures they suggested, though, such as fleeing to a cooler location, moderating your diet, drinking less alcohol, avoiding depressive thoughts, seem like sound advice during any public health crisis. And at least they didn't do any active harm, like, for example, suggesting one should imbibe bleach as a cure for the coronavirus. The masters' educated attempts to explain the plague represented their best effort to inform and protect the public. And their admittedly erroneous ideas about the pandemic made far more sense than some of the ones we'll see later in this talk, such as blaming the Jews for poisoning wells and causing the outbreak. During a pandemic, listen to the experts, even knowing that they aren't always right, and that their evaluations of the disease might change over time, and that the measures they put forth to combat the disease might not be 100% effective. During the early stages of the coronavirus, epidemiologists and public health officials offered contradictory information about the asymptomatic transmission of COVID-19 before finally recognizing its crucial role in the spread of the disease. The World Health Organization changed its opinions about the efficacy of wearing masks, at first advising that healthy people didn't need to wear them, and later recommending that they should. And that seems to be a settled point now, that you should wear a mask. And it is a major preventative part of combating the coronavirus. Despite these uncertainties, and despite some of these changes in expert opinion, compared to the misinformation about COVID-19 circulating on social media, or decisions about the pandemic based on political calculations rather than expertise. The evidence-based appraisals of scientists and public health officials are incalculably valuable and save lives, as they were likewise meant to do in the 14th century. Indeed, to push a little further on this point, presumably based on their own political calculations, politicians facing the coronavirus in the present have not only disregarded expertise, but even attacked, mocked, and actively undermined scientists who don't tell them what they want to hear. We might pause for a moment and appreciate how King Philip VI, facing a deadly pandemic, felt compelled to solicit advice from the leading experts of the day. He did not, for example, label them idiots or blatantly cast doubt on their conclusions. As Thomas File Jr., the president of the Infectious Diseases Society of America, observed in July of this year, to end the present crisis, quote, all of America must support public health experts. And he goes on to add that we must stand with science. Ironically, the willful rejection of expertise in the present seems inversely proportional to the scientific strides we have made since the era of the Black Death. The better we understand disease pathology, the harder some among us have to work to bury their heads in the sand and defy expert advice. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, 14th century physicians themselves didn't deny God's role in causing the Black Death, regardless of the pandemic's natural origins. Medieval Christians generally agreed that divine wrath at a sinful humankind was the ultimate reason for the unprecedented pestilence. The Bible offers numerous examples of such heavenly judgments provoked by human disobedience and sin, including the flood, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the plagues visited upon the Egyptians, to name a few. The book of Revelation, by the way, guarantees similar judgments in the future. Driven by the darker impulses of humanity, sin was a kind of motor, driving historical events such as wars, the rise and fall of empires, and natural disasters, intended by God to chastise the faithful and lead them back to repentance. Accordingly, in times of crisis, such as a natural disaster, medieval Christians prayed to avert the Lord's anger, not just as individuals, but collectively through appeals to the saints, ritual processions, and pilgrimages. The Black Death in particular elicited an outpouring of public religious devotion, sometimes to an extreme extent, as evident with the flagellants who whipped themselves and each other as an act of penance to beg for God's mercy during the plague. During the coronavirus pandemic, people of faith have likewise wrestled with the question of why, or even whether, God allowed the outbreak to happen. There's a range of opinions on the matter. Some Christian pastors have reassured their followers that COVID-19 was a natural and not supernatural force, a consequence of living in a fallen world, certainly, but not a direct manifestation of God's will. Others have emphasized Christ's authority over the natural and supernatural world, suggesting that this is a direct manifestation of God's will, insisting that the Lord has complete power over the pandemic. And these aren't fringe views. A March 2020 poll by McLaughlin and Associates indicated that, and I haven't had a chance to look into the polling, the details on their polling metrics, but this poll indicated that 44% of Americans were open to the possibility that the coronavirus was, quote, a wake-up call for us to turn back to faith in God. As state and local governments called for social distancing, church attendance emerged as an especially contentious fault line in the culture wars over COVID-19. For some ministers and congregants, civil authorities trampled on their rights by forbidding them to assemble for religious worship. Others believed that their faith, or being covered in Christ's blood, as one woman told a CNN reporter, would shield them from the illness. Churches nevertheless became hotspots for the spread of the coronavirus, even killing some prominent pastors who had rejected social distancing guidelines. And this brings us to our third lesson from the Black Death. Prayer is not enough to stop a pandemic. Now, I want to be perfectly clear here. I am in no way belittling the significance of prayer. It seems only natural that people of faith, from any religious tradition, would turn to God in the face of a deadly disease. We'll never know what emotional comfort or spiritual solace prayer gave to those dying from the Black Death, or from those who survived the plague and lost loved ones. And yet, I have to agree with the Dalai Lama, who made precisely this point, that prayer was not enough, in his response to the coronavirus this last spring. As he stated, I'm quoting the Dalai Lama here. This crisis shows that we must all take responsibility where we can. We must combine the courage doctors and nurses are showing with empirical science to begin to turn the situation around and protect our future from more such threats. This crisis shows us that we are not separate from one another, even when we are living apart. Therefore, we all have a responsibility to exercise compassion and help. Generally speaking, Christians in the Middle Ages, sometimes described as an era of faith, recognized for themselves that prayer and best practices for health, as they understood them at the time, were not mutually exclusive. Even in the midst of acts of collective religious devotion, cities still shut up their gates, passed sanitary legislation, and regulated commerce in an effort to limit the spread of the plague. And the flagellants, by the way, even by the standards of the Middle Ages, were extremists. They were eventually denounced by the Pope and banned as troublemakers by civil authorities in many places. Physicians didn't deny God's judgment lay behind the mysterious disease, but they also knew that God in his goodness had created medicine to alleviate such maladies. Their patients, they counseled, should repent and seek the best medical advice. You can read this in the consultation of the Paris physicians I mentioned earlier. Whether in the 14th century or the 21st century, prayer and science working together rather than at odds seems to possibly be a very powerful combination. In some instances, however, people's sense of identity through their faith could and did take a much darker turn during the Black Death. Religious animosity, coupled with what we would now call racism, fueled the most destructive response to the Black Death: attacks on Europe's Jewish communities, as Christians blamed Jews in parts of Spain, southern France, modern Switzerland, and Germany for causing the pestilence by poisoning wells, rivers, and springs. For centuries, above all during times of crisis or devotional enthusiasm, Christians had denigrated, demonized, and sometimes violently assaulted Jews when the mood gripped them. In retrospect, it almost seems inevitable that the Black Death provoked another persecution of the Jews. Sometimes angry crowds of commoners or townspeople attacked Jewish communities, burning Jewish men, women, and children alive. Sometimes they would take the children and baptize them and spare them. The faceless mob was not solely responsible. In other places, public authorities put Jews on trial, tortured them for confessions, and executed them for this manufactured crime. The Black Death warns us to beware of scapegoating during a pandemic. Sadly, this is one of the most important lessons, it seems, that we can learn from the medieval plague. During the coronavirus outbreak, ultra-nationalists, religious extremists, right-wing militias, and manipulative politicians around the globe have fanned the flames of racial or ethnic prejudice, linking the spread of the disease to one minority group or another. In the words of the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, COVID-19 threatened to unleash a tsunami of hate, xenophobia, scapegoating, and scaremongering. Gutierrez called on world leaders to strengthen the immunity of our societies against the virus of hate. Public health experts likewise called upon people to resist the urge to blame others for the pandemic. Quote, "Diseases can make anyone sick regardless of their race and ethnicity." This is from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website. Fear and anxiety about COVID-19 can cause people to avoid or reject others, even though they are not at risk for spreading the virus. Despite such efforts, some U.S. citizens and leaders have insisted upon linking Asian Americans, or Asians generally, to the spread of the China virus, or the Kung flu, as it's sometimes called. In India, members of the Hindu majority have attacked Muslims, claiming that they caused the illness. In Eastern Europe, authorities cracked down on the Roma as a source of danger to public health. Still others have again blamed the Jews for either causing the pandemic or taking advantage of the ensuing economic carnage. The choice to blame the Jews for causing the Black Death might have been unavoidable, but the destruction of Jewish communities was not. With admittedly uneven resolve, some rulers, bishops, mayors, and other leaders denounced such nonsensical accusations against the Jews and tried to stop the attacks. And you can read these accounts where they just recognize it makes just no sense that this pandemic could be caused by poisoning wells in the first place. Now, to be clear, they didn't do this out of love for the Jews or a modern sense of tolerance in the face of ethnic cleansing, what we might now call ethnic cleansing. Medieval Christians believed that they had a grudging responsibility to protect the Jews, part of a long-standing tradition that the adherents to the Jewish faith should be despised for their rejection of Christ, but not wiped out. This is sometimes called the witness theory. Maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A. Prophecies also predicted that a remnant of the Jews would convert at the end of time. Christian prophecies predicted this, meaning that some of the Jews needed to be preserved in any case. In addition to these theological reasons for protecting the Jews, some authorities in European communities seem to realize that such anti-Jewish violence might spill over into broader unrest that could threaten their own interests. Regardless of the precise reasons why, Christians in certain places managed to prevent the wholesale slaughter of Jewish communities. In the present pandemic, likewise, we might not be able to stop accusations against minorities, blaming them for causing the coronavirus. But we can work to prevent the violence and harm such accusations might cause. The fact that political leaders are sometimes the very one who feed the fires of such scapegoating makes that collective responsibility, I think, to oppose such fear-mongering all the more urgent. Speaking of collective action, the medieval plague also teaches us, this is another lesson from the Black Death, to respect the value of labor. During the Black Death, while some Christians lashed out at minorities in their midst, other elements of society, including agricultural laborers, mobilized to assert their economic bargaining power as the plague delivered an undeniable shock to the European economy. Modern historians often claim that the Black Death ended serfdom. That's part of what I'm getting at here. When the plague killed significant numbers of the rural workforce, so the argument goes, the survivors were able to demand higher wages and move elsewhere if they didn't get them, casting off the traditional signs of their servitude. This is a huge generalization. The end of serfdom took decades, if not longer, and didn't unfold uniformly across Europe. So there's limits to this idea that the Black Death ended serfdom. Nevertheless, as we can see ourselves, pandemics undeniably disrupt the existing economic order and call attention to pre-existing inequalities based on class and race. They can set the stage for social protest and demands from the less privileged, whose labor, always valuable and essential, suddenly becomes recognized for its intrinsic worth. This was certainly the case during the Black Death, as peasants, but also artisans, servants, and craftspeople began to make new demands of their lords, employers, and customers, recognizing the value of their labor and products in a world disrupted by the plague. One can read in medieval sources about serfs refusing to pay their taxes or to render owed forms of labor, about serfs renegotiating their rents or threatening to leave the estates that they were working on, about landowners enticing suddenly scarce day laborers with better wages or fringe benefits, including better meals or better among other forms of compensation. I should point out, most of the chroniclers who are, relatively speaking, members of the elite, most of the chroniclers who reported such changes, didn't hide their disapproval of such upstart peasants. As the History of Rochester reports, as a result of the pestilence, quote, there was such a shortage of servants, craftsmen, and workmen, and of agricultural workers, that a great many lords and people, although well endowed with goods and possessions, were yet without all service and attendance. What followed was what the chronicler calls an inversion of the natural order, as, quote, those who were accustomed to have plenty and those accustomed to suffer want fell into need on the one hand and abundance on the other. Needless to say, reading between the lines here, I think we can safely assume those laboring at the bottom of the natural order had a very different perspective on the changes that were caused by the plague. It should go without saying that whatever benefits a pandemic might bring for the less privileged, no one would wish for a deadly disease to strike their society as a means to an end, or maybe very, very few people. I suppose I shouldn't say no one. Measures of economic justice and social equality should be achievable without the spread of a life-threatening illness. Nevertheless, as the coronavirus started to strike and is still striking the United States, issues such as the minimum wage, access to health care, or worker protections have been leaping from the margins of activism into the mainstream. For those who have not fallen ill or lost a loved one, the greatest disruption to their lives from COVID-19 most likely stems from the ensuing economic consequences. In the early summer of 2020, the United States reported over 40 million jobless, the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression. The coronavirus exposed pre-existing inequalities in the American economy, as underpaid and underinsured employees at grocery stores, meat processing plants, hospitals, and elsewhere were suddenly recognized for what they had always been, namely essential members of society. The disadvantaged have not accepted these conditions without protest, pressing for proper compensation in the face of the coronavirus, calling for rent strikes, for labor strikes, walkouts from jobs lacking proper safety measures. Membership in unions and interest in unionizing has spiked in recent months. The outcome of these efforts remains to be seen. During and immediately after the Black Death, the wealthy and defenders of the status quo pushed back. In 1349, for example, the English crown issued the Ordinance of Labourers, followed 2 years later by the Statute of Labourers. These laws were something like a reverse stimulus package. They were intended to freeze the economy in place, limiting wage hikes, forbidding workers to refuse gainful employment when offered. Something similar happened related to unemployment benefits in Iowa a few months ago, by the way. Fixing prices at pre-plague levels. In the wake of the coronavirus, we will all have to face questions and choices that we're going to need to make about the shape of economic and social norms for years to come. And I think it's safe to say, again, the wealthy and powerful will push back. I might note that the privileged might find it in their own best interest not to resist calls for greater economic equity. It hardly seems a coincidence, I think, that stories of Robin Hood, the famous outlaw who took from the rich and gave to the poor, first started to circulate in England during the late 14th century after the Black Death. Thinking about the shape of the future brings us to our final lesson from the medieval plague for the modern pandemic. Not to forget as the immediate danger recedes. Clearly, pandemics mark important moments of potential transformation in history. Looking back at the Black Death, historians have seen a possible cause for all sorts of historical changes that contributed to the emergence of the modern age. As just mentioned, some of them argue that the Black Death brought about the end of serfdom, critical to the undoing of medieval Europe's feudal economy. David Hurley famously suggested that the lack of manpower after the plague forced Europeans to intensify their use of capital, diversify their economy, and design labor-saving technologies like windmills that led to the emergence of nothing less than capitalism. According to others, by shattering traditional norms and expectations about the human condition, the plague played a key role in bringing about the Renaissance, the rebirth of learning that supposedly marked an end to the medieval era. For still others, the Black Death helped to cause the Protestant Reformation by killing so many clergy that the Catholic Church had to replace them quickly with substandard recruits. The decline in quality of the priesthood, started in the late medieval Roman Church, led to a broader decline, according to this argument, that so much so that Europeans began to consider the unthinkable, breaking with the popes of Rome. Other scholars, I should immediately point out, are skeptical of such claims that make the Black Death the overriding force that caused such tectonic shifts in European or even global history. They posit instead that the plague intensified or accelerated pre-existing trends that would have led to such changes anyway, sooner or later. And I should note, I more or less fall into this camp. Still, it seems unwise to discount the historical impact of the medieval plague, especially if one takes into account the fact that the Black Death from 1347 to 1351 was not the end of the story. Once it arrived in Europe, Yersinia pestis stayed, causing regional outbreaks in 1361, 1369, 1374 to 1379, 1390 to 1393, and beyond, reappearing every decade or so, down through the 17th century. These sporadic and localized outbreaks of plague never caused anywhere near the levels of mortality as the Black Death. Nevertheless, the cumulative effect of such repeated trauma shouldn't be underestimated. Many of the changes attributed to the Black Death only make sense if one takes this long-term history of the pandemic into account. Happening just once, the global outbreak of a disease like COVID-19 can kill thousands, shutter economies, undermine healthcare systems, shut down travel, and trigger violence against minorities. Even so, I hope, such a singular crisis in and of itself seems unlikely to undo institutions, destroy democracies, end globalization, or somehow change the overall trajectory of history. If, however, the 2020 pandemic is but the first in a series of similar outbreaks, either of coronavirus or some other kind of disease, all bets are off. In the aftermath of the Black Death, some survivors of the plague drew the sad conclusion that the survivors hadn't learned the right lessons from the pandemic. Jean de Venette, writing in Paris, bemoaned that the world is not changed for the better on account of this renewal of the human race. For men were greedier and more grasping after the plague, since they could possess many more goods than before. They were also more covetous, and they liked to stir up strife amongst themselves through quarrels, disputes, and brawls. John of Reading, writing in England, across the channel, offered some similar sentiments. But alas, how quickly people forget the vengeance of God. It was because of the sins of men, or so it was believed, that God allowed the human race to be poisoned and destroyed by said pestilence. But people did not turn away from such despicable crimes. If the history of the Black Death teaches us anything, it is not to forget and move on with our lives like nothing happened after the coronavirus pandemic recedes. And it will recede. Sometimes it seems hard to feel that way or believe that, but it will. We need to prepare for the next pandemic now. Rather than seeking a return to normal, we need to rethink what normal looks like. Taking a fresh look at how we treat low-wage workers, access to health care, especially among minority communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. Take a fresh look at social programs meant to provide security for the less fortunate. We have to demand responsible political leadership. We have to support domestic and international forms of activism for social justice and build global institutions for equitable public health. Or I suppose support and sustain existing global institutions for public health. For years leading up to the coronavirus outbreak, experts sounded the alarm about the dangers of a global pandemic somewhere on the near horizon. They generally weren't heeded. Those same scientists, or their peers, have been warning us for decades about the disastrous effects of climate change, which is no longer deferred to the future, but already happening. I personally can't shake the chilling sense that the shock caused by COVID-19 to our political, social, and economic lives pales in comparison with the projected environmental disasters linked to global climate change, which will disrupt food supplies, fuel more pandemics, and cause massive numbers of climate refugees, no doubt provoking a crackdown by authoritarian regimes around the world. Will we forget and ignore those warnings as well? I want to thank you for your attention today in the remote format and would love to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Brett. You can hear the rapturous applause, I'm sure. I want you to just imagine it out there. It's coming in. Yes, please, exactly. I want to invite anyone who would like to drop a question into our question and answers button at the bottom here to do so. And as we're waiting for some questions to come up, I guess I'll float the first one to you. I'm curious about secular authorities and the lack of confidence. If that was something that happened in the Middle Ages, when people were confronted with this, certainly there was the idea that this could be retribution from God. Mm-hmm. But was there a sense of a lack of confidence in secular authority that occurred during the period, and how would that be manifested?
That's a great question, and there is a chapter in my book that didn't make it in this talk. I wanted to keep the talk somewhat more manageable thinking about people's attention spans while they're staring at a screen. But there's a chapter called Institutions Matter, which focuses in more on some of the measures taken by Italian cities like Pistoia. There's some ordinances intended to stop the spread of the plague in Pistoia. And again, as you read these, it's fascinating too. There's a lot of concern about monitoring meat and the slaughtering of animals. And I've been thinking about the meat packing plants and their coronavirus, and I haven't quite put this all together. But again, a lot of the ordinances banning travel, keeping the streets clean. People sometimes call this medieval healthscaping. And the idea that people were aware in the Middle Ages that general kinds of hygiene would help, at least do no harm, and might help prevent the plague. So there's a lot of interesting things happening there involving civil authorities. In more direct answer to your question, Max, I sort of make a joke in the book. I think that I've never seen any evidence of an open Pistoia now movement in the 14th century. You do find, though, I think in part because another point I should mention here, as bad as the coronavirus is, and I say this, some people watching might have lost loved ones here. I always want to be really careful not to minimize the harm caused by the coronavirus, but it pales in comparison to what happened with the Black Death. I mean, imagine a plague that kills like 35% of the population of the United States in 6 months, right? So it's a scale of disaster that I think is still hard to wrap our heads around. And as you can imagine, that did lead to skepticism. People, Boccaccio does say the people in the city, they tried to clean up the refuse, they tried to stop the plague, it didn't work. There's also a lot of complaints about doctors running away from their patients. Again, we know that a lot of doctors died treating plague victims, so you want to take these complaints with a grain of salt. But I think there was skepticism. I think it would be inevitable with the scale of the disaster.
Great, thank you for that. Again, I welcome folks to put in questions if they have any. And as we're waiting for questions, it's up to me to give you another one because here I am.
Hey, come on, folks.
Come on, folks.
Maybe no one's watching.
No, they're there. I can see them, but
Please, I love the Q&A. It's one of my favorite parts.
They're so full of
academic
information that they're digesting it all. So let me throw one out there, and this is purely speculative, and you can approach it, but however you like. But, another massive pandemic in early modern history is, of course, the European incursion into the New World.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if there was any sense of a dialogue that could connect those contemporaneously, or any sense of how Europeans were looking at the obvious effects of a pandemic among Native American populations.
I'd say two things about that. In terms of, say, Europeans in the 16th or 17th century, I've never seen any evidence that they witnessed the spread of diseases like smallpox amongst the indigenous peoples of the Americas and somehow drew any connections to the plague that had hit Europe. And at that point was still, as I mentioned, was still appearing in Europe, right, periodically. This is another interesting thing about the Black Death is there is evidence that the Black Death, to a certain extent, was largely forgotten after maybe 50, 60, 70, 100 years. And it wasn't really to the 19th century that historians started to almost rediscover the extent of the Black Death and the possible trauma it might have caused. So it's not clear to me that people in, say, the 16th century had the Black Death on their minds, even the same way we do. I will add, in response to your question, though, that clearly historians, now looking back, I think rightly, are constantly on the lookout, and this is kind of what I'm doing with this talk today, right? Trying to understand how pandemics do follow certain patterns or have consequences that might look very similar, say, in the 6th century with the plague of Justinian. There's the bubonic plague that happens in the 6th century. This is part of the whole revision of the history of the bubonic plague, in fact, is people realizing that there's been a lot more outbreaks of plague than we thought throughout history, in fact. And historians struggle with trying to figure out how plagues can impact societies and cause historical change. William McNeill's book, Plagues and Peoples, was an early attempt to think about this question. He talks about the Black Death and the spread of disease in the Americas, as you mentioned. A lot of the viewers are probably familiar with Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. So I think there's a lot of important historical work to be done comparing outbreaks of pandemic disease.
Great, thank you. We have some questions for
Yay,
you. Yay.
Yeah,
So Kim Church asks, what did stop the plague?
Well, so at a certain point, the idea, there's debate about this. At a certain point, after a certain number of people had died, what you see is that I mean, part of what defines a pandemic is when the bubonic plague leaps from rodent populations to human populations and then reaches a sufficient rate of transmission that it becomes a pandemic, a widespread outbreak of global disease. And the idea is that after reaching certain areas around Europe and after killing off a certain segment of the population, and by the way, some people, thinking of herd immunity, some people did survive the bubonic form of the plague. I mean, the survival rates could have been as high as like 40, 50%. If you get the pneumonic form, where someone coughs on you and gives it to you, you'll probably drop dead in like 2 days, like 90%, right? So that is super deadly. But the bubonic form that you might have gotten from flea bites, people did survive that and were effectively immune or a lot more resistant to the plague. So I think what you did get to is what we might now call herd immunity. Of course, they didn't have the benefit of vaccines at the time, right? So I'm not suggesting herd immunity as a means to end a pandemic. I think that's effectively what happened with the Black Death. Of course, the plague did remain enzootic, that is, in the rodent populations in Europe, once it was there. And that's why you had these periodic outbreaks happening. I do know some people have talked about the idea that the coronavirus, and this is getting outside my area of expertise, but like all of us, I follow the news about the coronavirus. I have seen it suggested the idea that we will reach a point, or through vaccines, ideally, where the coronavirus will stop being a pandemic, but it might become something like the flu. Like it could kind of be there and could still be around for years or like decades even. I think something similar happened with the Black Death.
Great. Well, thank you for that, and thanks for the question, Kim Church.
Yeah,
I have a
thanks,
question
Kim.
from Christy. Can you speak to the Black Death in Central, East, and East Asia, outside of medieval Europe?
Well, that is an excellent question, and I would refer you to Monica. If you Google Monica Green taking plague seriously as a global phenomenon or something like that. There's a journal, the Medieval Globe, and this is available online. And I would suggest downloading that and taking a look. It was a great resource for me, in fact. Monica Green's really a scholar who's been working.
So we're dropping that into the chat right now, so
Oh,
people
great.
can link right to it.
Thank you so much. And what you'll see in this book, among other areas, is that some of the most exciting scholarship on the plague is actually being done looking at the Black Death as a global phenomenon. There's been the recognition that the plague probably did originate in Central Asia, or maybe also the Tibetan Plateau, according to some of the more recent findings. There's evidence that it spread, as I mentioned briefly in my talk, quite earlier, that it might have spread around into rodent populations much earlier and much more widely. I think in the old model, there's the idea that like the plague starts in like the 1330s, and then it spreads like wildfire all over. And the new model is that it was endemic in part of the historical scene in Central Asia for a much longer time. There's still debate about just how much it impacted China or not. You can also read accounts of the plague by Ibn Battuta, who's a Muslim traveler in North Africa and the Middle East. He talks about the plague in Damascus. So there is clear evidence, in addition to Central Asia and East Asia, that the plague did spread into North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, and the Islamic world. So I'm a Europeanist by training. Latin is my research language. And I try to be very clear writing this book that I was focusing on Europe, because that's what I know best. But I do want to acknowledge that a lot of the exciting scholarship in studies of the Black Death right now is making sure people don't think that the Black Death was primarily or exclusively a European phenomenon. It was really a global phenomenon, well, global in terms of Europe, Africa, Asia. So.
And then Tom Zitlow had a similar question about social disruptions in East Asia and Central Asia. So that would be the same resource to go to see if there were these types of lack of faith or renewed faith in Islam, or again, social disruptions, finding scapegoats in Central Asia, or
maybe the one thing I will add in response to, it was Tom's question, is that I do think that medieval Europe produced a particularly rich repository of historical materials for looking into the plague. And in addition to, I suppose, some Eurocentrism, I think one reason that historians have focused on Europe so much in the past is, we do have Boccaccio, right? We do have letters mentioning the Black Death. We've got estate records from manors in England talking about, unruly serfs who are like running off and we have chronicles talking about attacks on the Jewish communities. Don't entirely quote me on this, but to the best of my knowledge, that richness of material is not available or is yet to be discovered in terms of like the impact of the plague in Central Asia or China. I do know, for example, that some gravestones have been uncovered from like the 1330s, which mention somebody dying from a disease. So historians suggest that could be evidence of outbreaks of the Black Death happening in China earlier than we might expect. But you're really working with fragmentary evidence there. I think it's the same thing in the Islamic world. You know, Ibn Battuta leaves this amazing account of the plague, but I think he's a little more exceptional. There are some Islamic doctors, I don't have the names off the top of my head, some Islamic doctors that discuss the effects of the plague on the body. So those materials are out there, but I do think that they're not quite as dense or easily accessible as the ones for Europe.
Well, that's what I have for questions, but if you'll humor me with one thing just to say whether there's any truth in it or not, there's a cliched stereotype that the Great Fire of London was it 1666? I hope I have my date right on that. Was the final death knell for the plague because it was urban renewal that came after that. Any truth to this?
And stuff, maybe?
Yeah, or that they rebuilt the city. I don't know. I had heard it before, and I, as a professional historian, I shouldn't be just throwing out stereotypes, but I want to see if there's any truth to that, or like what happened with urban renewal, cities getting better. Sanitation, or
I think that's a great question, and it's one that I don't have an easy answer for, in fact. But that's the sort of question. I suppose one point we might bring up here is that you'll hear lots of things about the Black Death and the plague, right? I've also had students say, "Oh, doesn't the whole ring around the rosy, pock full of posy thing come from the Black Death? All fall down." And I actually did some poking around on that, and apparently that's like a 19th century brine. You know, it has nothing to do with the Black Death, right? So I don't know if the Great Fire played a role in eradicating the plague from London, but you know, the idea that changes in urban infrastructure and hygiene could impact like the number of rats and the sort of common exposure to rats, fleas, I think could have some impact on it. I don't think it sounds improbable, but I would want to look into it.
All I know is I'm very proud of myself for pulling 1666 correctly out of the hat there. There's some things that we don't get rid of, and that's our ability to pull dates out randomly. So
I like it.
Well, we have no more questions from the audience, but if there are any final observations you would like to offer for the audience, and if any questions come in, I'll forward them in the meantime.
Just stay safe and stay informed, and support Carolina Public Humanities.
Well, that's what we need to hear.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Whalen. Brett, it's always a great pleasure working with you, and we look forward to having you at a live program sometime soon. I think we all would like that. I want to thank everyone for joining us today at Carolina Public Humanities. We look forward to seeing you at our online virtual events coming up. Go to humanities.unc.edu. Check it out what we have. Follow us on Facebook. And there is Dr. Whalen once again with the proper safety gear. Please, everyone, be safe and sound, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.